Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Policy Lab on the topic of weaving the urban territorial fabric to build more resilient European territories. Now, this sounds like a very complicated title, actually. It's a title that I will explain in a few minutes. But let me first say that my name is Martin Grisel. I'm the director of the European Urban Knowledge Network, and I welcome you to this joint webinar where we will discuss urban and territorial matters. We'll do so in support of the French presidency of the Council of the European Union. And we do this with a couple of speakers, three speakers actually, representing different sectors that we are going to discuss. Because today we are going to discuss the topic of food and energy supply within the current political situation, which has become quite complex, as you all know. We'll do that with Adrian Hill, the EU Policy and Communication Officer of Energy Cities, with Francesca Galli, who works at the University of Pisa, and K Bink, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Drift Institute. You'll see a glimpse of them, but I will ask them to introduce themselves, because first I'd like to give the floor to our host, our real host representing the French presidency, and that's Marine Dangeard, who will introduce you to the political, let's say, context of our debate, and then I will introduce the topic in further detail. So please, Marie-Lorraine, may I give you the floor to welcome our participants on behalf of the French presidency.
Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à ce Policy Lab conjoint urbain et territorial au nom de la présidence française de l'Union. La présidence française a souhaité mettre les enjeux territoriaux au cœur des débats européens. Elle s'est appuyée pour ça sur les nombreuses données fournies par le 8e rapport sur la cohésion économique, sociale et territoriale, et elle voulait inviter à prendre le temps de l'analyse et de la réflexion prospective sur les moyens les mieux à même de piloter les transitions démographiques, numériques et vertes. Dans ce cadre, nous resserrons ici la focale sur les enjeux à même de renforcer les liens entre le territorial et l'urbain, comme nous y invitent les agendas territoriaux et l'agenda urbain et la nouvelle charte de la EPSI. La succession de crises auxquelles l'Union doit faire face nous a fait prendre conscience de la nécessité, pour nos besoins essentiels, de ne pas mettre tous nos œufs dans le même panier. Elles ont mis en évidence l'importance de veiller à la sécurité de nos approvisionnements et de renforcer la résilience de l'économie. Autant d'enjeux qui, traduits concrètement, ont des impacts majeurs sur la maîtrise de nos biens publics communs, au premier rang duquel se trouve la gestion de l'espace. Déjà, le Green Deal avait mis l'accent sur des modèles de développement plus sobres en énergie, en consommation des espaces et plus respectueux de la biodiversité à travers l'objectif de zéro artificialisation nette. Les crises ont révélé le caractère très concret de ces enjeux, ne serait-ce que par la hausse des prix, de beaucoup de prix, qui conservaient jusque-là, pour une majorité de citoyens, un caractère un peu abstrait. Elles ravivent l'urgence de passer de quelques inflexions à un changement de modèle plus radical. Elles pourraient jouer l'effet d'un accélérateur de la mise en œuvre du pacte vert. À la nécessité de concevoir des territoires et des villes plus durables pour assurer à tous les citoyens européens une bonne qualité de vie, il nous faut aussi penser les conditions d'un développement plus autonome par la relocalisation productive de certains biens de première nécessité, sachant que nos actifs territoriaux naturels ne sont pas indéfinis. Réussir le pari d'anticiper et de planifier écologiquement nos futurs besoins en rationalisant la gestion de nos espaces et de nos ressources stratégiques. Il appelle de nouveaux modèles urbains et commande des relations ville-campagne plus équilibrées et porteuses de la notion de mieux vivre ensemble. Le partage de ces enjeux et leur mise en application est un défi majeur en termes de gouvernance de politique publique. Il nécessite une articulation concertée des cadres d'action top-down et bottom-up. Il ne pourra se faire par la contrainte réglementaire uniquement. Il faudra des objectifs stratégiques européens et nationaux partagés, mais il nous faudra aussi le soutien de l'ensemble des collectivités régionales et locales et des populations. L'apprentissage mutuel, mais pour le faire, on a encore beaucoup plus de questions que de réponses. L'apprentissage mutuel des expériences les plus concluantes aux quatre coins de l'Europe pourrait être un facteur clé pour faire aboutir cette ambition commune. Et c'est sur cette problématique globale que je compte sur des échanges qui pourront nous éclairer. Merci.
Lorraine, I will take over now in English. I'm not sure if everyone understood French. I'm not entirely sure if there was interpretation from French into English, but we will continue now in English for sure. I will partly also take over from Marie-Lauren's introduction by emphasizing that this webinar actually takes place against the background of different political documents that have been adopted at the European level. And what I said, this is a joint urban and territorial webinar. Now, some of you might know that the urban people, when it comes to urban policy making, and the territorials do not always meet in the same groups. But here, we thought that it would be really important to have a joint session. And this is actually also due to the fact that some of the political preparations in 2020 under the German presidency actually prepared this joint cooperation between urban and territorial experts. In 2020, as Marie-Laurent also explained, the new Leipzig Charter was adopted. It highlights different aspects of the city, the just city, the green city, and the productive city. It also emphasizes the importance of digitalization as another dimension to urban policy making. On the topic of these interactions and the relations, focusing on the just city and its relations with the other dimensions of the city, we held a series of webinars. Now, in the same year of this new Leipzig Charter, the Territorial Agenda 2030 has been adopted, adorned by the Ministers for Spatial Planning, Territorial Development and Cohesion, and that took place in December 2020, also under the German presidency. Now, this strategic territorial agenda promotes territorial cohesion by providing an action-oriented framework aimed at rebalancing territorial dynamics and ensuring a future for all places and all people. At the same time, it also addresses today's global challenges and the complexity of those challenges. Now, the Ljubljana Agreement, which took over from the new Leipzig Charter and also builds on the territorial agenda, called for an integrated response, and it invites also the trio presidencies, the future trio presidencies, of which the French presidency is now the first one, actually, to provide an exchange platform for urban and territorial policymakers. And with this policy lab, that's exactly what we're going to do. So what we're going to do is what we did was to find a topic that is of absolute relevance to both urban and territorial matters. And we choose the topic of energy and food supply. And of course, this has a reason. The Ljubljana Agreement was written when COVID was on top of everyone's agenda. Now, the Ljubljana Agreement, of course, did not take into account the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And I think these two crises really come together. The COVID pandemic and the dramatically changed geopolitical relations with Russia only underlined even more the already existing debate about Europe, the need for Europe to become less dependent on foreign imports, and then more specifically, be less dependent on, let's say, on food and energy supply from countries outside the EU. Now, this, of course, coincides also with the ambition of Europe to become more self-sufficient, more economically robust, and greener, of course, and more sustainable. And this is exactly the topic of today. Now, this coincides with this geopolitical situation, and under the French presidency, a Versailles Declaration has been adopted, which calls for building on the strength of the single market in Europe to make the EU's economic base, more resilient, and also more competitive, while staying at the same time, while ensuring at the same time this green and just transition. And that's crucial because, I mean, you can be competitive but not being very green, and this is exactly what Europe wants to do. It wants to be competitive but be a leading region in the world when it comes to green and just transition. And in this perspective, the Versailles Declaration argues for improving food security by reducing dependency on imports of essential raw materials. And here, what I said, we're going to focus on agricultural products and inputs, and at the same time, of course, energy. And now with the war in Ukraine, the dependency on Russian gas and oil has also received another political dimension. Now we see that crises impact societies, and they can worsen also the territorial divide. And this means that it challenges the existing relationship between urban and territorial entities. The many repercussions of a territorial divide contribute to the aggravation of the social divide by exposing part of the population to food and energy precarity. And this is what we see today with the spikes in energy prices, but also the inflation figures that go up. So that means that we need to renew the assessment of urban and territorial linkages at the wider EU level to help foster food security systems, agricultural and energy production, while at the same time diminishing the environmental impacts on the urban and rural convergences. But this policy labs now really aims to assess whether governments are implementing measures to respond to the forthcoming tensions and resources, and whether societies are actually ready to adapt in a transformative manner. We know that at the beginning of the COVID crisis, we were in a way naively optimistic and saying, well, let's not waste a crisis, let's make things better, let's rebuild better. I think with the war in Ukraine, this becomes even more important. And we need to take this just and green transition seriously. Food and energy are two of the most important pillars when it comes to these urban and territorial linkages. The increase in food and energy production leads to artificialization of fertile soils and can create also tension in land use. And that raises a couple of questions that we would like to discuss today. For instance, how to ensure a balance between energy and food production? How can tensions be overcome to ensure the security of food and energy production? If we really build on the Green Deal launched by the EU, we need to boost the circular economy, focusing on food chains and also biodiversity. And we also need to enhance and monitor value change. And at the subnational level, that means that we need to translate zero net artificialization, aiming at curbing urban sprawl and preserve the land. Well, these are big topics that we want to discuss today. And for that, we need the support of some fine experts. And with this, I would like to start. Before, actually, I would really ask the panelists to introduce themselves. I would like to get to know our audience also a bit better. What I said, this webinar takes place against the need to bring together urban and territorial experts. I would like to ask you in our first poll questions, we have a few more, what you are working on. Are you working on urban matters? Are you working on territorial matters? Are you working on both? Or are you really working on something completely different? So can I ask our production team to launch the poll in Mentimeter? Let us show how this works. Can we show the link for Mentimeter, perhaps? You will see a code. I don't see the Mentimeter myself, but that's because I'm in a different setting. You should be able to see a link and a code on top of your screen, allowing you to enter the results in Mentimeter. And I know that our co-panelists are not able to see it because we are sitting in a distinct, let's say, video setting. Now we can see the, here we have the code and we have Mentimeter. So the question is, are you working on urban matters? Are you working on territorial matters, on both, or on something completely different? Okay, I understand that the poll has been launched. I do hope we have more than 2 participants, but I see there's an equal repetition of, at least, well, there's one. Okay, here the results are coming in. Apologies for the delay. That's always a bit tricky, of course, with technology, indeed. Okay, well, at least we see that it's sort of an equal spread between the first 3 responses. It's changing a bit now. We do have some urban people, we do have some territorials, if I may say so, but the majority is actually working also on both. We don't have any experts coming from another field. That's good to know. It also means that indeed we managed to reach out to the right audience. Let's close this Mentimeter now, and let's go to the second question, actually. And that's more about how you cooperate as experts. So the question here is, how often do you cooperate with experts on urban and territorial matters? Is it very often? Sometimes? Well, that's okay. Sometimes, but you should actually work more closely with them, or if you do you never cooperate with them? Okay, let's wait a bit more here. Okay, well, it's good to see that indeed there is this close cooperation, although some people say it should be more. Well, I hope at least that with this webinar, we can promote that. I can tell you that this trio presidency will have not just one joint session between urban and territorial, but also a second one later under the Swedish presidency at the beginning of next year. So these are nice opportunities. Okay, let's close this poll now. Thank you for the audience to provide your input. We have a bit of an idea of who you are. I would now like to invite to the stage Adrian Heel, who is the EU Policy and Communication Officer at Energy Cities. Well, Energy Cities is a well-known network dealing with this topic. Adrian, I understood that you have just recently also opened a section in your organization on the food. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was based very clearly on the needs of our members. So we represent about 1,000 cities across Europe, and they're all engaged in this quest to become climate neutral by 2050. That means becoming resilient and decarbonized cities. And food is an unavoidable part of that discussion. Right now, we're focusing largely on the demand side from cities. So what can cities do in terms of their procurement? But in the larger scheme, whether you're talking about energy or food, we don't achieve our goals as energy cities, as cities in Europe, without that linkage between urban needs and rural supplies, whether that's food or whether that's windmills around the periphery of a city, agrivoltaics. There's a lot of debate to be had there on how best to join up these forces in that supply and demand. But it's very clear for us, with our ethos of local and sustainable, is very much the starting point for everything we do. And you only achieve that, those urban needs with those. sorry, I cut out there for a moment. That's broadly speaking,
okay.
The introduction to energy cities, and we'll get into some more of the details later.
Okay, I was afraid my connection wasn't good because indeed I'm sitting in another part of the world, but it was yours. No, we'll come back to that, Adrian. But it's a pity we missed the last few sentences. I think it would be interesting still to hear what you said in the end. And I would like to ask you one more time. I mean, how does energy cities now relate to these topics of food and energy? And what changed within your organization after, indeed, the discussions on COVID and also the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, so our 30-year history has been largely focused on the decarbonization and democratization of electricity. We've since expanded into energy, because then you're talking about decarbonization of heating and buildings and industry, which is a broader topic. And now this year we've added a food hub, because ultimately all of these systems become intertwined as we electrify and grow our share of renewable energy. In terms of changes between COVID was obviously a massive test for our members, our 1,000 cities across Europe. It was a chance for them to find new ways of working, but ultimately it was a very clear example that their strength relies and is dependent on their relationship with their citizens and maintaining that trust so that you can implement fairly large shifts in city policies and mask mandates and lockdowns and all of this kind of thing. There's a fundamental issue of trust and communication that has to exist in order to drive the change that we're going to need, whether that was to deal with COVID, whether it's to deal with climate change, and now with the urgency to get off of Russian fossil fuels. It's going to require some very large behavioral changes, at least in the next 12 months.
Okay, interesting. Let's come back to that. I think that's a very good complement to what you just said. Let's move to our next speaker to introduce herself, and that's Francesca Galli. Francesca, can I ask you also to briefly introduce yourself, your organization, or well, it's University of Pisa, we know, but I mean, then more specifically, I mean, how your work relates to the topics that we are going to discuss today. Francesca, please introduce yourself.
Many thanks, Martin, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting webinar. I'm a tenure-track researcher in the Department of Agriculture, Food and Environment, and where I teach a master course in food policies and a bachelor course in agricultural economics. That is my training. I have a PhD in economics and territory in the domain of agricultural economics. So I bring here today a more rural perspective to the debate. In the past 10 years, I focused on several topics regarding food systems challenges, such as the food quality policy, the assessment of the sustainability performance of local and global food supply chains. And in the later period, I adopted a food system approach to understanding problems related to food and nutrition security, with a specific focus on food poverty. In a later stage, I focused on the connections between rural and urban areas, so the synergies that allow rural and urban areas to flourish, and the analysis of governance arrangements that can support these processes. I'm part of a research group which is called PAGE, Pisa Agricultural Economics, that if you're interested, you can check our website. In general, we share an interest across different departments on socioeconomic research in agriculture, food, and rural development. And collaborating with higher education, advisory work, we hope to support the transition to sustainable and resilient food systems. So thank you again for the invitation, and I look forward to our conversation today. I cannot hear Martin anymore.
Comes back all the time that we discuss also urban issues. It's also part of this new Leipzig Charter that was adopted under the German presidency. How do you see any changes between urban and rural relations? I mean, there are some people saying, well, it's not a dichotomy. I mean, there's an overlap between urban and rural. And now the two are so much dependent on each other. What is your stance on that perspective? I mean, it's perhaps a complex question to answer very quickly because we're still in the introduction phase, but I would find that really interesting also to know from you.
I'm sorry, I think I missed the starting part, but I think I understood the question. I would like to comment or to share my experience, because the food system framework that I mentioned earlier, which is the framework that we use to try to understand better the shocks and stresses that impact on food systems outcomes, which we're interested in. So availability, access, and utilization of food and their stability over time. This framework was elaborated long before the current crisis, exactly to address and better comprehend these problems and how to face them possibly. So the next question would be how the situation is affecting our current food and nutrition security, and how our ongoing policy, as we heard in the introduction, going to be redirected to address this crisis. From an EU perspective, we are starting to read and to try to understand situation. And the European Commission tells that we're not facing mainly a problem of availability of specific types of foods. We will struggle more on some products than others, such as sunflower oil coming from Ukraine, lack of fertilizers. But these are just pieces of a bigger puzzle that we're just starting to understand. What is really worrying, and this is very timely, the webinar today, is the shortage of energy that will impact the price of inputs and raw materials. And this will have an impact on the most vulnerable groups in food systems, that are farmers and low-income groups. This is not much of a surprise. So the challenge is, on one side, you hear the voices of those who advocate for a change of approach. That is, the crisis has changed the priorities that we agreed with the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork, and the new Common Agricultural Policies, while other voices instead affirm that the current crisis, and I believe this is the stance that we take today, can imprint a speed in the transformation. So, of course, I can raise questions to which we still don't have answers, but in terms of reducing the dependency from Russian gas, should we encourage the investment into biogas production, for instance? And should we do it in a more sustainable way, learning from past experience, so without affecting food security? So trying to avoid the trade-offs between food production and energy production. And the other thing... Yep.
If I may interrupt you, we're not yet in the second round, but I was just asking a small question, but we'll come back to that. I think this is...
Okay, I thought we were just already moving forward.
No, not yet. No, not yet. No, because I would like also to introduce our third guest first, and then we'll come back to the second round, because this is indeed, this goes beyond the introduction. But thank you. We'll come back to this, and I'm sure you'll be able to finish that, because indeed, Annick K Bink is our third guest, but second food expert. Annick, same question to you. Please introduce yourself in around 3 minutes or so. What do you do? What is your organization, and how does your work relate also to the topics that we are discussing today? Please, the floor is yours.
Will do, Martin. Well, good afternoon to everybody. Great to be here today. Should be just 2 slides that I have prepared as an aid. But my name's Annick K Bink, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at DRIFT, which is short for the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions, and we are based at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And as our name already signals, we work on transitions, know-how and how-to through research, education, consultancy, and activism, and we hope to kind of weave those elements into each other. So what we do in research really feeds into our education and in our advisory work, and kind of feeds into our activism as well. And we do this by exploring dynamics of fundamental societal change, such as the X-curve framework that you see in the top right corner portrays. And this figure really visualizes the pattern of a build-up in transitions towards a desired system, and how this is intimately connected to a pattern of breakdown of the systems that we no longer want. So it's a tool to help us think about how do transitions occur, and how can we pinpoint kind of leverage points and accelerate these transitions. And so we use this knowledge, like these frameworks and how these patterns in transitions work, to accelerate transitions to a just and sustainable society. And so me and my roughly 30 colleagues work on all kinds of transitions, such as transition in agri-food, which is more my domain, but we also have people working on energy, mobility, health, circular economy, biodiversity, and so on. Next slide, please. And then a little bit about me. I have a background in nutrition science, transition thinking, and foresight studies, and I've obtained my PhD in sustainability science by doing research or focusing really on food system change and the role of local actors in addressing such global problems. So my research really focuses on exploring transformative potential of urban food, a little bit on the role of equity and justice in food systems, and wherever I can, I try to use a critical foresight perspective to explore how this kind of future lens can contribute to more sustainable action and governance, but also in trying to reflect on how diverse images of the future really shape food governance. And I've done this by working on various EU-funded projects that all focused on food system change in a broader sense. But I've also worked more specifically on projects that focus on innovation in the urban food domain. In addition, I've contributed to assessments such as one for the CGIAR on climate change implications on food systems, and one for the closely related COSI, which is the Commission for Sustainable Agriculture Intensification. Get your acronyms right, which focused on the role of innovation in shaping sustainable food systems. And I'm also contributing to an ongoing assessment on the transformative potential of the EU food policy mix for the European Environmental Agency. So all hopefully very relevant for today's session. Thank you.
Well, you can skip this hopefully, because this is absolutely relevant. I mean, we'll talk about transition, transformation. I don't know if you know, but the subtitle of the new Lively Charter, which is now the leading, let's say, political strategic framework on urban issues, is the transformative power of cities. And this is really, well, now, of course, we're not talking about cities exclusively, also the rural areas, or the urban-rural relations, urban-territorial relations, of course. But indeed, this need for transformation, transition is more needed than I think ever before. And the big question that we need to discuss today also is how to speed up this transition or transformation, as we call it. Let's now indeed move to the second round of our discussions. What I said after the introductions, we have 3 more rounds. So we're going to talk about now in more detail about energy and food, and in the third round, we are going to talk about future scenarios for urban and territorial relationships. And then in the last round, we're going to collect some questions that are going to be submitted to the joint meetings of Directors General for urban matters. On one hand side, these are the urban people, but also the Directors General on territorial cohesion, who represent the more territorial and spatial aspects of the EU policy making. So indeed, in our discussion, we can contribute to the discussions that will take place later on the 24th of June in this joint meeting of the Directors General. I think, Francesca, you already started sharing your thoughts on the second round, and sorry that I interrupted you, because I saw that you started the whole debate. But I would like you to indeed describe for us what your perspective is on the current situation. I mean, you mentioned a few issues already, but perhaps you can recapitulate that very briefly. What is the current situation when it comes to energy and food production in Europe? And then, of course, more specifically in the light of the current crisis. And I'm referring also to COVID, of course, and the dependency on the difficulties with food supply chains, for instance. But now, obviously, with the changed geopolitical situation in Europe, with the situation of Russia, and what it means. I mean, Ukraine, as a huge producer of food, has suffered, of course, obviously, also when it comes to food production, in actually producing what it used to do, and it means that Europe has now started the debate of becoming more more independent from foreign food supply. So what can Europe do, and what is your stance on this whole changed, let's say, discussion on energy and food production in Europe, please?
Thank you, Martin, and sorry to have anticipated your question earlier, so I'll try to recap what I was trying to say. And I was mentioning the food system framework as a framework of reference, which was thought as a way to understand the challenges that are occurring today and that have occurred earlier and in the last decades. So the first benefit of using a food system framework is that it obliges to look at the food and nutrition security multiple dimensions. So not only the availability of some products and some inputs, but also in terms of access and utilization of food. And so they accent on understanding who are the most vulnerable groups of our societies to which we should target our policy efforts. So earlier I was mentioning some of the challenges that and the opportunities that come from the current crisis in terms of reducing the dependency from Russian oil and gas, and how to do it in a sustainable way. So I was mentioning biogas production, how to take to the next level the production of biogas to make it more sustainable, or reducing the dependency on chemical and mineral fertilizers and pesticides. So the role of precision farming to be developed further, and to rethink the role of organic farming. Can this still be the way forward? And also there is a big debate on the reduction and valorization of food loss and waste. So how to make sure we reduce that, and at the same time we guarantee a food surplus redistribution to vulnerable groups, which is a situation that clearly emerged during the COVID pandemic. And more in general, how to really adopt a food system approach to make them more able to withstand these shocks and stresses. So relocalization was mentioned a few times. And is this really a viable how to make this a viable strategy without going back to we don't want autarky or independence, but we want healthier food systems. So in my modest view, the food system approach, if applied fully also by policymakers, is still suitable to interpret the current situation. And my personal research interest, which is reflected in the last project, is how territorialize the food system approach, because this can be used in very abstract terms. It can encompass the global food system as a whole, but the real challenge or interest that I have is to downscale it to the territorial level. So really putting the emphasis on the connections between urban, peri-urban, and rural contexts more widely. So why are these rural-urban links important for local food systems? These, you were mentioning the importance of these links, which is reflected in several policy documents, not only the new urban agenda, but also the long-term vision for rural areas, which was released in 2021. So understanding food and nutrition security and socioeconomic and environmental outcomes of food systems at local level. This implies a good mapping and data collection because urban authorities are increasingly interested in understanding local food systems, but there is a lack of understanding very often of how these flows linking urban and rural areas in food systems really work. And it's not easy to map them out in a comprehensive way. The other point is understanding and exploring governance dynamics. So in one of the projects on rural-urban links that I was involved in, we spoke of governance arrangements. And by arrangements, we mean institutional and organizational instruments beyond established governments and boundaries. So experimenting new models of deciding together around common objectives, multi-stakeholder engagement, negotiation, some degree of autonomy and collaboration. And I'm sure Annick will bring this topic forward in relation, for instance, to food strategies and food policy integration networks. I can bring my experience from Italy. I live in Tuscany, and we had the chance to explore a case in Lucca area. Lucca province is an interesting case of intermunicipal governance around food, where the municipalities reach out beyond their administrative and functional boundaries by creating ad hoc participatory governance models, which implies recognizing the role of food system and planning as tools for municipalities to fulfill functions across boundaries, so encompassing the whole territory. And these, of course, are experiments. Another example comes from the more rural context, the communities for food and agrobiodiversity, which are multiplying now in our areas, focusing on the governance of ecosystem services, for instance, biodiversity. So linking several actors, including farmers, but not only, engaged in preserving ancient varieties and making sure that this value, this public good, is valorized in connection to value chains and to urban context. So I think I can stop here and hear your reactions and questions if you have. So thank you, and I'll leave it to the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca. Let's move to the second speaker, indeed. I mean, and change a bit of perspective with Adrian. Can I ask you also the same question, Adrian? I mean, how would you describe indeed the current situation from your perspective when it comes to energy and food production in Europe? I mean, what is your analysis, let's say, coming from energy cities? You start laughing. Yeah, why is that?
It's been changing quite quickly.
I can imagine. Yes, indeed.
It's difficult to pin down from one moment to the next because it can change from one week to the next. Certainly, what Francesca was just talking about fits perfectly with what we've seen from our membership in regards to food. In regards to energy, certainly, you know, we've been working on this energy transition for quite some time. It's suddenly become much more urgent because of the crisis in Ukraine. However, you're at a point where the ability to react on the ability of the energy system to react in the next 12 months is fairly limited. Obviously, the Commission is doing its best to diversify suppliers of fossil fuels. We want to push efficiency. We want to push renewables. But most of those projects are already baked into the timeline for this year, for the next 12 months. So we're not going to see a huge shift. And that leaves behavioral change. That leaves energy savings. So what we saw last week in the Repower EU package that was released was EU Save. We're calling the Energy Cities Energy Saving Sprint. So this is building on work that the IEA has done in terms of trying to change behaviors. It's a program that will be launched with the Covenant of Mayors, with the Committee of the Regions, with Energy Cities and other city networks to try and, at the local level, change behaviors to save energy, whether that's electricity or fossil fuels or what have you. It's all interlinked in the same system. So we need to really change that behavior. Now, what we're doing, because obviously these things are all locally based, and the energy mixture is locally based, over the next few months with the Commission, we'll be looking at organizing local consultations, brainstormings, whatever you want to call them, where the cities and citizens and interested bodies can get together and develop a plan, figure out where are the savings that can be most easily made, most rapidly achieved. And then at the Sustainable Energy Week in September, we'll have a coming together and an accounting and sort of really launch the energy savings ahead of the heating season. To try and cut back on that. And it's worth looking to the past for lessons. Ireland ran a energy savings campaign in 2004 to 2006. They spent 10 million euro. Basically, every person in the country saw the messages, saw the benefit of saving electricity in terms of carbon, or specifically in terms of saving money. It basically had zero impact on energy consumption in Ireland. Compare that to Japan, where after the Fukushima crisis, the government of Japan launched an energy savings campaign, and they modified energy consumption by 15%, which is huge. So the plan that the Commission has launched last week targets a 5% savings, which frankly is still very ambitious, but absolutely achievable through a whole slew of different activities, and those will be targeted on a local level. I think one thing to keep in mind is that this is the crisis is what helps us. The deputy mayor of Brussels had a meeting with the head of the unions last month, and he wanted to discuss energy savings. Now, normally, this is a no-go sort of topic. You're talking about turning down the temperature in the office. You might talk about driving more slowly, whatever the case is. But in this case, the deputy mayor was really bracing himself for a difficult conversation with the unions. But because it was in solidarity with Ukraine, because there is an external crisis that's forcing these actions, it was not a confrontational meeting. It was like, how do we do this together and faster and as effectively as possible? So I think what's going to be really key over the next 12 months is tapping into that willingness of people, of businesses, of unions to modify behaviors. And we need to give them the tools and the information and the help to do that. One big part of that, which maybe is a bit in the next section of way forward, but we're really going to need to see a lot of collaboration between local governments, regional governments, national governments, and the EU. We all need to work together in order to really drive these messages and energy savings techniques home. So that's one thing in terms of the current landscape. That's the short-term view. The longer-term view, which is sort of these the new targets around energy efficiency and renewable energy for 2030, which are now much more ambitious, is how on earth do you implement this? We've had a study released this week that looks at the local bottleneck. For our members, the willingness to do things isn't enough. It's the people, the human resources in their offices, in their cities, to be actually able to implement these changes. So to picture what I'm talking about, if you look at repower, you're looking at district heating in most urban areas. Well, that involves a whole slew of consultations and planning and engineering works. You're looking at modal shifts. So that you're talking about redesigning street level furniture and how streets operate and mobility plans. You're looking at electrifying heat in buildings, which will have implications for the local grid. Every rooftop is meant to have solar power. If we could miraculously do that tomorrow, much of our local grid simply wouldn't be able to handle that kind of electricity on a sunny day. It's not by any means an insurmountable problem, but it does require really detailed technical local planning in conjunction with heat, with mobility, with electricity, with food, and biodiversity. And to do that on a local level is going to require a tremendous amount of resources. So our estimate was that by 2030, Europe is going to need about 214,000 more people at local level. So that's about 2.5, that sounds big, but it's 2.5 people per city per year between now and 2030 to try and organize and do the consultations and do the coordination to make this stuff possible. It's not just about the money. It's about the planning to make it all happen and make it happen at the same time. So for us, that's really, really key. The money you're looking at is about 16 billion euros a year across the EU. So again, in the context of a lot of the numbers we're talking about, this is not an insurmountable problem. But there are governance issues that will allow local governments to hire the people they need, to train up the staff that they already have. If we don't do that, we can have all the targets we want for energy and for food, but we're not going to achieve them. And so that's, broadly speaking, what our focus is now. In the short term, it's energy savings, and in the longer term, it's implementing a lot of these ideas around farm to fork and around Repower EU, and that is going to require a lot of boots on the ground because that's where the changes are going to happen.
Adrian, I wanted to ask you one more quick follow-up question. You mentioned this campaign in Ireland and in Japan. Mm-hmm. In Ireland, it was not successful. In Japan, it was extremely successful, 15% energy saving. Can you describe what was the main difference between these two campaigns? I mean, why did it work in Japan and why didn't it work that well in Ireland?
It's the sense of urgency. It's the crisis. It's never letting a crisis go to waste. In Japan, that's broadly speaking it. In Ireland, the motivation was you can save €20 off your bill every month. Well, if I have to change my behavior 5 times every day, and the payback is something that I mightn't necessarily even recognize on my bill at a certain point in the future, very difficult to do that. If the motivation is the front page of your newspaper showing what's happening in Ukraine, that's a very powerful reminder to get on your bike.
Yeah, indeed. Perhaps I said in my introduction, I think that at the beginning of COVID, we were perhaps a bit naively optimistic about also ideas of never waste a good crisis. Perhaps with Ukraine, this might be different because people feel it also in their own wallet, of course. I mean, the energy prices, and there's this absolute necessity of really also changing our behavior. I do hope that indeed the public is willing to change its behavior, of course. And what you said, we need people for that to start this communication with the general public. I think it's a very strong message from your side, and I'd like to thank you for that. Okay, let's continue now with Aniek, whom I haven't yet asked the same question. Indeed, Aniek, what is your analysis of the current situation? And I mean, of course, I suppose you will look more specifically into food production, but you're allowed to say a few words also about energy if you want. And then from your perspective, please, indeed.
Yes, which will be a foresight and transition perspective. And again, I have some slides because I do like to have beautiful images accompany my talk. But essentially what I kind of hope that my talk will encourage you all to do is to really reflect on this question, what is the future of food? And that you reflect on what you think should be part of that future, both in kind of the urban and the territorial sense, and perhaps also for the future of energy. That you start kind of thinking about how can we strengthen kind of innovative but radically different ways of doing that connect to that image of the future that we have. And for that, I've been trying to answer this question through my research and kind of what is the current situation, you asked, Martin. Well, this will not come as a surprise, but I think we're at the moment facing major sustainability issues. And I think it's really important to keep emphasizing these points, that food systems are really responsible for 30% of GHG emissions, that they are a major contributor to global biodiversity loss. And when we look at the human dimension, we see that an increasing number of people go hungry on a global scale, and that in Europe, a lot of people are also suffering from diet-related diseases. They're even the main cause of death. But also there's a lot of injustices across the value chain, and that a lot of people are still left vulnerable and without a proper livelihood. So looking at what the system looks today, in all fairness, I think the answer to that question is that the future looks pretty bleak. So it's quite obvious to say that we need fundamental societal change to overcome this persistent, unsustainable food system. So in order to kind of get an understanding of how we can direct the system into a more desired direction and to kind of spur on that fundamental change, we need to reflect on this question: what is the future of food and where do we want to go? And Francesca already pointed to this a little bit, but I think in moving forward, we really need to start altering our perspective to thinking about sustainability and food systems, because sustainability issues cannot be considered outside of the system that they are part of. So taking a system perspective becomes vital for understanding these challenges and for finding ways to address them. And by taking a system perspective, oh, sorry, next slide. I forgot to say that. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. So in taking a system perspective, you can see the multiple dimensions that make up sustainability and how these are interlinked, as this visual also shows, which is something that we've developed in the project. And this kind of perspective allows for the opportunity to see how actions and policies can have synergies across dimensions, but it also highlights that there is the risk of trade-offs between dimensions, or that actions might even have unintended consequences. And looking at these points, I think the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork are already a step in the right direction as they look across the system on how to address food system sustainability. But there are also very clear blind spots, judging by how we assess food systems, but also in how we define food policies. And well, this is a little bit my topic, obviously, but I think that the dimensions of equity and social justice are often overlooked or even missing. And for example, what is included in the Green Deal is a rather narrow understanding of just transitions, focused more on kind of proposing compensation mechanisms for people who are not included in the transition that is unfolding, instead of really weaving it into kind of the fabric of decision making and policies, and allowing for justice to be front and center in the transition itself, rather than an afterthought, so to say. And so this search for the answer to this question, what is the future of food, I've been kind of pointed into the direction of urban food systems to try and find practices that can strengthen food systems. Next slide, please. And when we look at the urban scale, we can see a very broad range of different practices that provide just and sustainable alternatives. And I think that this is partly because sustainability challenges are felt perhaps the most in cities, partially because of the density of people and activities that are going on in cities, but also because it's kind of, there's stark disparities between socioeconomic status and opportunities. And it's this necessity for change in the urban environment, this kind of desire to see things in a better light, in a better way, that we see as a very strong driver for citizens, social groups, and social entrepreneurs to develop new alternative ways of doing and thinking and organizing food systems. And it's these radical new ways of doing that, to me, provide hopeful glimpses of how we might shape more just and sustainable futures. And so my research on urban food systems really shows that urban innovative practices build on food as a vehicle for change. And I think that what makes food so powerful is not just the many relations that it has to these broader sustainability elements, as I showed in the circular visual, but also that it connects to the individual and the personal level, as food is essential to our health, cultural expression, and identity. And there is a very wide range of urban food practices that build on this connection that food can forge, really providing a foundation for principles of justice and well-being. And I always like to stress that this goes a lot further than urban agriculture alone. There's a lot more diverse practices in the urban domain. For example, food justice organization that emerged across Europe to address food poverty, or the image shown top right, which is food entrepreneurs in Rotterdam who provide ways for people to grow mushrooms on leftover coffee grind and to kind of become more circular themselves in their daily life, or the community garden that's at the heart of Rotterdam, bottom right, who provide kind of more livable and green spaces to people who cannot afford urban green, or perhaps who would otherwise be in social isolation if they didn't have kind of access to such a meeting space. Next slide, please. And this is also my last slide. So in short, I see huge transformative potential in the urban food domain, and I see clear glimpses of what I would like the future to look like. And I say this not because of the production volume or the yield that you can gain from urban food practices, because that's not a lot at all, but it's really for the social values and the principles that they're able to weave into the urban fabric. And by doing so, they can make the urban space more livable, more prepared for climate impacts, which I think is a very important point, by providing shared spaces that can result in more cohesive neighborhoods, but also to create spaces and practices that can educate and create awareness, which are obviously intrinsic to changing human behavior. And I think key to why these practices are so valuable is that in cities, they find a place-based way of addressing these sustainability challenges, and both speakers have already pointed to that, that it's important to really tailor kind of our solutions and interventions to what are local needs and challenges. So all in all, I think it's these alternative urban food practices that have kind of the values and that can build the foundation for more sustainable and just cities, and that they can really increase the potential for social resilience as well. So I hope that when you do reflect on this question, what is the future of food, that you start kind of seeing the potential of urban food within that. Thank you. That's my contribution.
Yeah, thank you very much, Annick. It's interesting that it's part of your thinking. I was asking about the current situation. You move forward on. You look forward to the. That's part of the transition mindset that you're in, I suppose. That's really interesting to see. Now, we have a few questions also from the audience, and I would like to stimulate that also. And one way of doing so is to actually take on board some of the questions. There is a question from Delphine Bourdin who asks to what extent public procurement at the EU level could also help us to move faster on food relocalization and development of territorial resilience. Do you think indeed that at the EU level, public procurement can also play an important role? What is if we think about indeed the role of let's say national, but perhaps even also at the EU level, Commission policies when it comes to public procurement? What is your stance on that within this transition frame set?
I think that public procurement and kind of standards or bringing in standards for sustainable public procurement can definitely accelerate the transition to a more sustainable food system, even if it's just to kind of increase the number of, for example, agricultural farming within Europe. And it's really about kind of showing that, kind of being the good boy in class. And I think that that's really a responsibility that we should take on and not wait for the momentum to arise. So I definitely think it's a very good strategy.
Yeah. Are there any other ways you think that, also thinking about, we're working a lot with European Commission, with member states, what would be needed to further promote this transition? I mean, that's, I think, a key question I would like to ask everyone, actually. Now, you very strongly emphasize on the social aspects of food production. I think that's an absolutely right point. It's important to emphasize this just aspect. And what I said, the French presidency is focusing a lot on this aspect of the just city. We should also look at it from the perspective of just food production and just energy supply. What can be done at the European level or at the national level or at the local level in your perspective to make this really much more concrete?
Yeah, I think from a transition perspective, what we see, and also kind of building a little bit on the work that I've been doing with the EEA about the food system policy mix at the EU level, we see that there is really a need to focus on radical innovations that are able to result in transformation of system rather than on innovation that lead to incremental change. So it's again about kind of thinking of what is the future that we want to move towards and what kind of practices or innovations link to that future. So this might also mean that looking at kind of the policies that we have and thinking that there is a certain policy legacy because there is a history of policies that have already been developed. How can we, to ask yourself, how can we maybe phase out policies that don't work or convert policies that are missing their mark, for example. But I think there needs to be a new perspective on what innovations we want to stimulate, like what connects to that future that we want to go towards, rather than kind of stimulate innovations that kind of keep us in the system that we're already in and kind of optimize what we already have. So I think that's a major part of what we should be doing and what is currently a little bit missing from the policy landscape.
So radical change is what you're preaching here.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And but to do that, I mean, to continue the discussion, how to convince policy or let's say decision makers, basically, heads of states. Let's look at the level that we can reach out to, the directors general. I mean, it's a pretty high policy level, of course. I mean, how to convince the DGs that this radical change is really needed. But let's not answer that question immediately. This is actually the question for our last round. But you can start thinking about that. Let me stop here because I'm going too fast. But this is absolutely fascinating. Let's bring in Francesca. Francesca, I would also like you to ask you the same question. Actually, what would be needed? I mean, your play for indeed having a much more systemic view on food relations, indeed, and balancing out the different spatial levels, urban, peri-urban, and rural. What would be needed in your perspective to change that, to implement actually this approach of a food system framework? What is missing at the moment, and why is it not functioning as it could?
Well, continuing on Anik's comment on public procurement, I was thinking that there is already a policy. Public procurement is kind of the paradigmatic example of systemic policy, because it can act both on the consumption side and on the production side at the same time. And what's really the bottleneck, in my view, is the lack of policy integration, because green public procurement or sustainable public procurement is localized in the environmental policies, while the implications on agriculture, health, and social policies are much less evident. So the challenge to me is really the integration across these domains to make the instrument more effective and to really unfold its potential in terms of systemic effects. But as far as I understand, you were also asking me the wider question. So our question number 3, so in a broader level, what I think are the ways forward. And again, drawing on my experience, on my research experience, I see a clash between what Adrian was saying before, so the emergency, how to face the emergency, and my more reflexive perspective coming from my job, so the understanding. But I would like to emphasize that, for instance, the rural-urban linkage focus is a new perspective for policymakers. And this requires to capture, visualize, and understand links, which entails data collection, which of course takes time. But visualization, effective visualizations, not only for policy, but for society as a whole, means recognition of linkages. And recognition changes the behaviors. So it's absolutely crucial that while we face the emergency, we keep investing in understanding links. And so, for instance, another example comes from the debate that we had on mapping ecosystem services and flows across rural and urban and territories, and how to make sure that these ecosystem services valorization supports decision making and urban planners to take decisions in a new logic, considering that ecosystem services are not only from the rural to the urban, but also vice versa. So understanding this flow is key. But there are methodological, epistemological challenges, both in small cities, but also in large metropolitan areas. So we saw that the same challenges affect the Lucca area, the small towns in Tuscany, as well as Lisbon in Portugal or Frankfurt in Germany. So there is need for accessible and reliable knowledge on mapping these territorial food systems and rural links. And the relocalization strategy as well implies that policymakers at urban level and also other levels are aware of how what the gaps are in the local food systems in order to be able to steer investments in structures and processes which are missing or less available. So understanding which products should be supported, but also encouraging processing plants, which for economics of scale reasons have been reduced and concentrated in specific areas, which this reduces the capacities of food systems to work at local level. The second point is that the rural-urban perspective encourages to experiment with innovative governance tools. So investing in districts, networks, communities, which can be also defined by law, are defined by law, transcending administrative boundaries. So focusing, as I was saying earlier, on common objectives and causes. Experimenting new contractual solutions, for instance, remunerating farmers for public goods, through payments for ecosystem services. And this should be done by agricultural, rural, and urban policies together. So again, a matter of policy integration, which needs specific strategies to work. Otherwise, it just doesn't happen. Connecting to international networks. So I think I should mention the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact that you may know already. So a platform to exchange good practices internationally and steer urban planners towards safeguarding urban, peri-urban lands for agricultural purposes. This can happen through the various means. So, for example, we were discussing at local level the valorization of peri-urban lands through agricultural parks, which have both a leisure function and a productive function. And in this regard, visioning and negotiation, so scenario making, shared scenarios, elaboration among a variety of actors at territorial level is a precondition to be sure that we share the principles for the strategies that we elaborate. And and in this regard, I should re-emphasize the role of small and intermediary cities and surrounding territories. So not only the big mega cities or the metropolitan areas, which are essential for the revitalization of local economies, as the pandemic has shown very well. And these can be beneficial. Working at this level can be promising for both urban and rural, and it can have an impact widely in Europe. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Francesca. Thanks for answering the next question that I indeed also wanted to ask already, but I'd like to ask it now also to Adrian, which is our third question indeed, to build on the urban and the territorial linkages in these future scenarios. What, in your perspective, you might have said already a couple of things about it, Adrian, but what do you think would be the role of these urban territorial linkages in the future scenarios when it comes to the production of energy and food, and to make it more balanced? Because after all, this is also what we need to look into. How do you see this? What is your stance on let's say any future potential for revising perhaps the linkages between more urban areas and other areas in the European at the European scale?
I mean, there's tremendous potential, so much so that building these linkages is absolutely vital to achieving the targets we have. They don't happen without building those linkages. In the context of food and energy, there have to be some very clear discussions over things like agrivoltaics and biomethane production, where you're going to have food and energy in direct competition for rural resources to feed those urban areas. And it's not for me to say which one is right and which one is wrong. It's to ensure that those rural regions and urban areas have the skills locally to be able to sit down, to look at their own energy planning, their own heat mapping, and figure out what they're going to, which one is going to best meet their needs, and which one can they best supply. What solutions work best for those rural areas, and to do that, you're looking at intergovernmental support, governance issues, whether that's on a national level or on a regional level, bringing those rural and urban areas together, and it's about having the resources locally so that people can, cities can acknowledge their needs, examine them, gather the data, as Francesca says, and start to solve the problems. We see a lot of our cities, as they're moving into the food area, they might have one or two really great projects, or they might be looking at a food systems approach and be struggling on how to implement that. But there's no question that that radical change that Anik was talking about is absolutely necessary. And it only comes through a food systems approach, as Francesca says. But we need to have those resources locally to actually act on them.
It's interesting that you mentioned this idea of conflict, a potential conflict. Can you give me an example of where or how such a conflict might arise indeed? I mean, it's clear, I mean, the way you see that how conflict should be solved, indeed, I mean, by participation, dialogue between different governmental levels, obviously, multi-level governance approach, of course, but it would be interesting to hear, let's say, what are the potential dilemmas if we think about food and energy production, or indeed, I mean, any potential conflicts that might arise indeed.
Well, certainly the Commission's target of 35 billion cubic meters of biomethane by 2030 is enormous. It's going to take a lot of land. And now there's a whole debate about growing food for biomethane. There's agricultural waste that can be used. You know, there's different ways of doing it. But that target is huge. The land required to do that is huge. And I'm not really clear on how that target gets met without overriding local, urban, or regional concerns, because there's going to have. The only way I see that land being designated for biomethane is for a very top-down, heavy-handed approach, and that concerns me greatly in regards to building this radical transformation that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you. Anik, you mentioned, let me ask you, there's also a question about the urban and territorial linkages in the future scenarios. I mean, very briefly, because I think you already mentioned some of it already, but I would like to ask you indeed, I mean, what would be the way forward indeed to strengthen these ties between urban and territorial, to balance out, or at least to work with potential conflicts? How do you see this? This would be interesting, building also on what Adrian just said.
Yeah, I think I agree very much with what the previous speakers have already said, and it's not a matter of should we strengthen these linkages. We really have to, especially looking at kind of the current urgency around both climate change, but also the crisis that's ongoing in Ukraine, and kind of the moving away from dependency on Russian gas. So there is definitely, I think these crises have kind of, to some extent, put climate action on pause, which is a major risk for cities especially. I mean, we already know that food security is under pressure, and that food systems are kind of not taking the pressure very well. But we are kind of moving towards a future scenario where cities are becoming less and less livable as the planet gets hotter. So I think in this we're going to have to look at, firstly, kind of what Francesca also mentioned, the kind of a relocalization strategy. So how can we create food systems that are just kind of more mitigating in terms of emissions, that are that emit less GHG emissions, but also how can we adapt our cities and the hinterlands around it to make it more livable areas. And that's where I think a lot of nature-based solutions, and some of which might include food, like the ones that I mentioned, will really have to be implemented. And I think, as to your question, how can we kind of make that work? I think there is a big translation that needs to kind of be done when it comes to taking these more broad stroke EU kind of visions that are kind of included in policies and translate these to the regional and the local level. And I think Adrian already pointed to that as well. So I think we really need to create spaces for the exploration of more region-specific policy approaches, so that we can really tailor kind of local approaches to whatever challenges these regions face in particular, and kind of adapt to the context they're in, as regions across Europe are different in terms of biophysical, cultural and socioeconomic context, but also in what sustainability challenges have priority and which are felt the most urgent. So creating such a space where we can have a different set of actors from the various layers that are kind of within the policy area to come together and to discuss their needs, interests and objectives will be really vital to explore kind of what is a more region-specific transition arena, and to find out where are obstacles within the system, but also where are there opportunities for collaboration. Maybe I'll leave it at this.
Yeah, wonderful. Let's stay with you, Annick, because I would like to start now our last round, actually, which is what I already mentioned to you. Indeed, what would be your question to the joint session of the two groups of directors general that will meet on the 24th of June? If you would have a chance to raise a question to be discussed by the directors general responsible for urban matters, but also the ones, sometimes the same, but sometimes also really different people responsible for territorial cohesion. What would you like to raise in order to implement this, well, perhaps even radical change as you are trying to promote?
Yes, well, I think what I've tried to convey, at least today, is that there is massive participatory potential for transformation in both the urban and the territorial domain, in both food and energy, and in the diverse kind of innovative practices that emerge, like social innovation that emerge from these domains, from citizens, social groups, entrepreneurs, you name it. And given that we are at a crossroads when it comes to sustainability action, I really believe that we need all the help we can get. So how can we kind of build on these practices and social innovations that emerge from cities and territorial kind of areas, and how can kind of the European Commission kind of support that transformative potential of such participatory approaches, and kind of to harness kind of these innovations that emerge from this domain to be included within the broader governance approach. So how can we support kind of social innovations that emerge within the urban and the territorial domain? I hope that question was clear.
You mentioned Commission to support, but also member states. I mean, the Director General are from member states. So both Commission, you would say both Commission and member states to support these, let's say, this innovation that is already taking place in society, enabling it and harvesting it.
Exactly, and to hopefully empower it as well, because there is kind of valuable action that is within that. And like I said, I think we need all the help we can get.
What kind of help would be welcome?
Any help that kind of brings us towards a more sustainable society. And I think that is kind of a collaboration that is not just kind of for public actors, but it's a multi-actor kind of project, right? Everybody will have to bring in their bit to make this transition a reality. So how can we kind of work together and ensure that any kind of participatory kind of move that we see, that it's also harvested, and that we don't let it kind of simmer out, so to say.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Annick. I'd like to ask the same question now also to Francesca. Indeed, how to facilitate, the question you would like to raise to this joint meeting of Directors General. I mean, what should be discussed at that joint meeting to make sure that we also have this different view on urban food systems, for instance, as you just also promoted very clearly. How would you frame that? How would you, let's say, try to reach out?
I'm sorry, I lost the connection, but can you hear me?
No, yes, I can. So Indeed. So let me repeat. I mean, how would you like to reach out to the Directors General in this joint session, promoting, defending in defense of the statements that you just made?
Yes, thank you. I would like to link to the specific debate on the current renationalization of the Common Agricultural Policy through the national strategic plans. My question is how to maintain the coherence with the EU overarching strategy, strengthen this coherence, and avoid the competition among member states on the implementation, a race to the bottom in terms of environmental standards, and vice versa, which is more appropriate in terms of who this question is posed to, how to take the chance of this renationalization of national strategic plans for agriculture to encourage a better integration of rural policies with urban and territorial policies. I hope it's clear.
And I think here you touched upon, I think, a fundamental point indeed, this competition between member states, which is, of course, if you think about this, a real, well, at least a potential reality. I mean, a real factor that we need to bear in mind. Thank you for raising that issue. Adrian, I'm also looking at time. We don't have that much time anymore. Adrian, I would like to ask you the same question indeed. I mean, what to discuss? What should we definitely raise in this meeting of the Joint Directors General? What would be your point?
First thing they should be discussing is how do we get energy savings on the agenda at the EU Council? We absolutely need member states driving this with the EU and with local government. It will not work otherwise. So their challenge is to get it on the agenda. The second thing is then much more about the governance around the local and rural resources and how to align those. How do they speak with the national governments to ensure that there is either a legislative process or a discussion body where these issues are actually being raised? Because as the other speakers noted, a lot of this is externalities that don't get brought into budgets and that they don't get brought into policy. So we need to think outside of that limitation.
That's a very clear message, Adrian. I think I cannot agree more with you. I mean, this is absolutely fundamental that we should have a wide EU policy on, or I mean, not just a policy. I mean, we need to implement concrete plans to ensure the saving, and it should be on the agenda, a top priority of the agenda, not just at the EU Council, of course, obviously, but also at the member state level and in all the different cities, because there's no other way to be less dependent on foreign energy supply. I mean, the best way to do so is to consume less energy. That's obvious. Thank you for that. It is already 3:30 in Europe. And I would like to thank all the speakers for their contributions. What I said, I think it was interesting. We had a 1.5 hour, really interesting debate, and we could have continued easily much longer. But I will not do that. I will finish this in a few minutes. But just highlighting that indeed we have a few very, very clear messages. I think we will convey also to the Directors General this need not to work with, let's say, relatively weak future scenarios, but to see how a radical change can be implemented. But in the meantime, indeed, also taking very concrete and immediate steps, thinking about energy savings, thinking also about involving the general public, which is absolutely crucial, of course. Without doing that, it's absolutely important. And I think what Francesca also said, this idea of having a different view on urban food systems, looking again in a different way about different cooperation possibilities, avoiding competition between member states in food supply. I would like to thank all our speakers for these wonderful contribution. I would like to thank also the production team and my colleagues at the European Secretariat in The Hague. I would like to thank you also on behalf of the French presidency. And I don't know if Marie-Lorraine would like to join in to say, to formally close this session, but let me just thank all of you. We will produce a report, and we will report back into the meeting of the Directors General. So this discussion was not just a theoretical discussion. We will try to make this as concrete as possible on the 24th of June. Thank you for now. I'll close off here, and thank you all very much for your attention. Bye-bye.